We're going to be turning this into this. Watch the video. Okay, so Flux just came out. Obviously, it can produce some crazy images, but it also has the ability to produce photorealistic images, if you know how to do it, that is. I'll be using ComfyUI in the video, but you could apply this to anything since most of the things I'm going to be doing is just focused on the prompt. I also have a video about SDXL where I talk about creating photorealistic images with SDXL. That video uses some extra tools and stuff. In Flux, I won't be using any extra tools. Well, partly because they just don't exist, so that's a good enough reason, but two, because the prompt adherence in Flux is much better, so you can get more out of just using the prompt. Also, if you don't know what Flux is, you don't have it installed, you don't know how to use it, I have a video about installing Flux, and it also explains a lot of the hang-ups that people have that confuse them. So we're going to be starting with a blank canvas here. I say blank canvas, but it's not blank by any means. So I don't know why I said that. We're going to start with some settings. If I didn't tell you that the settings changed, then it didn't change. We're going to have the same settings for all of the parts of the video, so don't worry. So the settings we're going to have here are, we're using the Flux dev model, the full version to the 16-bit model. We're using T5 F16. The seed we're going to be using throughout the video is going to be 1, so all of the images will have the same seed. We're using the basic guider. Essentially, the basic guider amounts to having your CFG at 1 if you're using other UIs. When it comes to CFG and Flux, it's a bit more complicated than using CFG with other models. It basically means you can't really use negative prompts in Flux. The sampler we have here is EULA. The schedule is going to be at the simple schedule. Steps are going to be 20, and the size is going to be 768 by 152. It's going to be a longer image because generally images at this size or this more portrait-esque resolution is better for portrait images, and it looks better when you generate at that size. Oh, we also have the Flux guidance set to 3.5 as well. So those are all the settings that we have. And again, if I didn't mention any setting changing, it's the exact same thing throughout the video. And the prompt we're going to be starting with is something relatively simple, a portrait of a woman. And if we start with that, the image that we get is this. Not exactly realistic, not exactly terrible, but I would say nothing too crazy if you compare it to, say, SDXL. The first thing we're going to look to change prompt-wise is compared to SDXL, the way in which you prompt with tags versus tagging with a caption, it's definitely starting to push you more to this sentence direction. That's how it was trained, and it seemingly has a deeper understanding of language altogether, meaning that you're very much biased towards using that sort of prompting methodology. So in keeping with that, we're gonna swap the prompt from being a portrait of a woman to this right here. We go from a portrait of a woman to instead we have a portrait of a woman, so the same thing, and then we have subject, the woman is wearing a t-shirt, foreground, a table, background, a door. Generally, when you're generating images, one way to make images look more realistic is to have more elements in your image. You want to have a foreground, you want to have a background, you want to have stuff taking place all around your images. I think with SDXL, it was kind of hard to communicate items being in the foreground versus being in the background, and you have to communicate something like a woman in a restaurant, since generally that would mean having something in front of you and something behind you, because it's harder to communicate depth. With Flux, it's easier. I'm specifically choosing a prompt format like this. One, for ease, it's easier to kind of follow, but two, it shows the difference in terms of the ability to use these more weird prompt styles where you could have subject, foreground, background. And if you use this as your prompt, the image you get is this. So this is the image you get, right? So immediately you get the woman. She's wearing a t-shirt. Behind her, you could very easily see that there's a door. You could see that there's a table in front of her. In keeping with what the initial thing that I just suggested, where in order to make your image appear more realistic, you want to have more elements. You want to have like foreground elements. You want to have background elements. You want to have elements in the middle. Okay, if you just have a person and they're in the image and they're just standing there, the image will be very boring, look very flat, and not as interesting as if you have more things happening in the image, right? In keeping with that idea of depth added to your image, you can add depth in terms of like, well, actual physical depth, but you can also add depth in terms of having more descriptive captions of the image. So if we go back to our prompt here, instead of just having a woman wearing a t-shirt, you can instead say the woman is wearing a Asian the woman is wearing an Asian woman. You can have the woman is a Asian woman and she's wearing a pink blouse. The idea there is you're communicating more information about what the woman is by saying that it's not just pulling from every single woman that exists inside of the model, but instead you section off some specific thing that it should focus on to make the fidelity of whatever it's generating be more accurate, as opposed to trying to pull from every single woman at the same time and coming up with some more generic female. Instead, it gives you a very specific thing. Pink blouse, a t-shirt is a fairly boring thing to be wearing. So by getting a blouse, it's more interesting to look at. You're gonna have frills and folds and these sorts of things, whereas a t-shirt is very boring. That tends to add to the realism of your image, having more realistic elements to it. for the table, instead of saying a table, we say a mahogany table. So we communicate more depth to give it more specificity. And instead of having a door in the background, instead what we swap to is a various assortment of analog televisions. The idea there is analog televisions are much more interesting of a thing to have in your background than just, you know, plain old door, right? They're more interesting to look at. They're gonna break up the scene a little bit more and have something that's more dynamic. And if we do that, we end up with an image like this. So you can see here that her skin now is very smooth. Like, it doesn't look as good as the last image. Her skin doesn't look as good necessarily, but we have more of the elements incorporated in the image here. We have the things behind her, we have her, we have the mahogany table, we have her sitting there. Much more interesting altogether. Now, to make the image even more interesting, we can add more detail to the person. Because this is one of the harder elements in general, because prompting for this is not easy because the terms aren't as readily available. But in general, one of the big problems you're going to have with your prompt is that people have very smooth or plasticky looking type skin. That's one of the things you want to get away from. And the image that we just had is very obviously smooth and plasticky type skin, right? So one of the ways you can try to get away from that is by communicating the sort of skin that you want. The reason why it's kind of hard is because people generally aren't the VLMs that they use to produce captions for these things. And people generally, when they're captioning images, don't usually caption the skin texture of someone, right? It's not a common thing. So it's kind of hard to pull out those via captions a lot of the time. But a way that you can do it with these models is you can communicate things like freckles. You can communicate things like pimples, which are also generally communicated. You can communicate things like moles on your skin, which are generally communicated, to try to put it in that direction. Keep in mind, you're not gonna, if you do this, you're not gonna have a freckly, pimpled, mold person with covered from head to toe. These things tend to have a smaller effects because of just the overall like rarity of these sorts of tags. They just don't have as large of an effect as possible, which is why you have to have so many of them to even start to push the thing in the direction that you want. So the prompt could be, now, the woman is an Asian woman with freckles wearing a pink blouse. Her skin has a rough texture with pimples, moles, beauty marks all over her skin, and the pores of her skin can be seen. The pores of her skin can be seen. You're not actually going to see the pores of her skin, but again, you're really trying your best here to like bias the model in a certain direction to just add more detail to the skin. And one very important thing is when you say things like pores or you say things like freckles, the images that would even mention that are higher resolution or higher detail to begin with, because you generally can't see someone's pores or freckles from a very far distance. So the fact that even adding that to the prompt increases the quality of the image, simply for the fact that the only images that you would have access to freckles are already high quality images. You understand? When you're adding detail to people, then obviously do skin texture, do all of those things. But if you're adding detail to objects, generally what you want to say is imperfections. So if you have a mahogany table, you want to say a scratched table, a beat up table, these sorts of things. So we want to say now a scratched, worn mahogany table that shows the woman's reflection. You know, adding these extra bits here to make the table more interesting and not just say, you know, a random table that's just there. And insofar as the analog TVs in the background, that's easy enough. You simply just say the TVs are showing something. So in this particular case, we just go a various assortment of analog televisions showing K-pop singers. So the idea is that you just have a thing showing in the background, so K-pop singers showing in the background, and that's enough to make the image more interesting. And if you come here now, you'll see that the skin of the person is improved relative to the last image. Now we have stuff in the background, we have K-pop singing. Keep in mind, this is like a random thing. You can show anything on the TVs, right? But just, it makes the image more interesting overall to have these things. Also, the table is super better because it's so scratched up and dinked up relative to like the first image. It's just a lot better relative to the first thing. We haven't really talked about the lighting or the camera in the image. Like, one of the things that you can do is talk about camera settings, but I've noticed that camera settings, at least on Flux anyway, seemingly doesn't have as big of an effect as it has on SDXL. So ultimately, I was testing a bunch of different settings, but what I settled on was just like a camera brand, f1.4, ISO 400, 80mm lens, these sorts of things. But I found that it wasn't really having much of an impact at all. It wasn't really changing things. So I ultimately just removed those and I didn't use them. But instead, what you can do is camera brands, and they were having an effect. And specifically, Hasselblad was a camera manufacturer that was having an effect. Another interesting thing about Flux as well, Hasselblad with a lowercase h wasn't having the same level of an impact as Hasselblad with an uppercase h. And this is one thing that's different, again, from Flux versus like SDXL or the other models, is that Flux is case sensitive. So there are some instances where if you do not capitalize a letter, you will see a difference in the generation, and this is one of them. Hasselblad with a capital H was way better than Hasselblad with a common H. So keep that in mind when you're doing this. Instead of just having a portrait mode, we have shot on a Hasselblad camera. The room is filled with soft, natural light. The background is blurred. Also, we add the background is blurred. One thing you'll notice about Flux is that it tends to just always make your background blurry. In fact, people have been complaining about this because it seemingly is like, it's so common that it's very hard to remove, okay? It's one of the biases that definitely seeped its way into the data, even though the researchers talked about reducing biases and these sorts of things. It definitely, every image you put out is just gonna be blurred, okay? With the exception of like, say, flat drawn images or these sorts of things, you're gonna end up with blurry backgrounds a lot of the times. So if you're already gonna get it, you might as well put it into your prompt so that if you get a blurred background, it's gonna be a higher quality blurred background, and it's not just putting a random paste over everything. It's intentionally trying to add a blurry background to your image, so that's the reason why that's there. So this image is more of a minor change from the last image, but it's definitely noticeable, but it is a small change nonetheless. So now we're going to be adding a lot more detail and dynamic interest to the image, right? So first thing we're going to add is a portrait of a 25-year-old woman. The idea here is, instead of just pulling from every single woman that exists, similar to how we added Asian, we're going to specifically add an age as well to narrow things in, so it at least is looking at a very specific subset of the model, as opposed to looking at every single possible thing that exists. It has a more specific thing, so we add that in. We also describe her expression. We haven't really given the person an expression, so they just default to this like expressionless look. And granted, the expression that we're giving them is kind of like also vague as well, right? A serious expression is what we're gonna put here, but still, this is it's better to present something than have it to just come up with it. When it's looking at random pixels, if it has a direction, it's gonna have a lot more correctness to it. So we have, she has a serious look on her face, looking into the camera. Oh, we have looking into the camera because we're trying to affect the action that's happening in the image, and we're going to change some other things as well. And this is going to become more useful like lower in the prompt. So for all of the images, she was clearly sitting down behind the desk. What we're going to do now is we're going to have her standing up, which should be a bit more interesting, right? So we're going to say she is standing, leaning forward towards the camera. So we want to try to have something like this where she's leaning forward, holding herself up with her hands on the table, and she's looking over her shoulder at the camera, which is over the corner of the desk. Okay, so the whole point is to try to position the camera in this region here, have it be pointing back at her, have her looking at the camera like this, slightly up, and have a more angled image going down this way. The point of that is, instead of having the image be dead on, if you just slightly move off axis, the image tends to be a lot more interesting. That's what we're trying to do here. We didn't ultimately succeed in that necessarily, okay? But still, this is the idea of the prompt of what we're trying to accomplish. Trying to make the shot more interesting. Another way we try to bias it is we say, you could see a window partially in the corner. What we say here is, a white window is partially seen to the left of image, allowing some natural light in the room. The point there is we want to have it where if it could see some white window off into the corner, it has to essentially turn the camera a little bit in order to accomplish the purpose of having like a little white window somewhere on the side of the screen that's like allowing light in. And this is the image that we end up with. She's clearly leaning over, she's standing up. Oh, I forgot to mention, we also added to the prompt, since she's going to be standing, we also want to add like her pants as well to the prompt. Otherwise it's going to automatically fill in something. And we say she's wearing a pink blouse and khaki pants is what we end up saying here. Yeah, if we look at the image here, we could see she has a pink blouse, she has the pants, she's leaning over. Not exactly what we wanted. This is actually what I was more going for, by the way. But still, doesn't matter, okay? This is what we got, and it gives you a more naturalistic feel. It feels more interesting than having her sit down at the desk like this. It's more interesting to have her like do something. The next setting we're going to change here, and the first setting we're going to change, Flux guidance. In general, guidance, when you reduce the guidance, the Flux guidance, by the way. Okay, don't confuse this with CFG, by the way. When you reduce the Flux guidance from like the 3.5, which is the default, down to around like 2, I think about like 1.5 to about 2.0, but we're going to be reducing it to about 2.0 here. It tends to increase the realism of the image, okay? With some trade-off, but it tends to increase the real. It makes it look more realistic. And we can go and see here and see that it did that to the image, right? Of course, the image itself, I would say, suffered in terms of overall quality. The image looks too like flat, and now it looks a little bit more like, it looks a little dusty. It doesn't have a lot of the same sharpness. but the other image was a little too sharp. This is one of the issues with like dropping the guidance with Flux. But keep on, don't worry, we're not finished this yet, but this is one of the things that you can see. What we can do to try to address this dustiness is how I like to call it, okay, when you drop to 2.0, is that we could swap the sampler to this sampler here, right? There's the days, I don't know how to say it, days, and you could also swap the scheduler here to DDIM uniform. Typically, this works better for the image. And keep in mind, this sampler works better when the guidance is low, but when the guidance is high, it does not work better, okay? So it works better with the low guidance, not with the high guidance, okay? We change the sampler to days and the schedule to DDIM. And then we still have the same Flux guidance here at 2.0. But we also change the steps as well to about 30, since it tends to perform better at that amount, right? So, and then the image that you get now is the improved version of the other image, where it has more detail, and you don't end up with the same dusty effect, right? You don't end up with the same kind of dusty effect that it had. It has now more sharpness and it feels better of an image. So you get to retain the additional realism from dropping the setting, but not the bad dustiness, for lack of a better word, that you have when you drop the guidance down. And then the next thing that you really want to do is Ultimate SD Upscale. What it does is basically take patches of the image and upscale them individually. Keep in mind, one of the things that you can do generally when it comes to trying to improve the quality of your images is do like a second pass. So a second pass is you take the image from the first sampler and you upscale it a little bit and you run it again through the denoise. So if you do image to image, you generate your image and then do image to image on that image. That's like a second pass, right? The issue with that is it doesn't work as good for Flux. With Flux, the image to image doesn't look as good as it is with like Stable Diffusion or any of these things. It's just not as good. So instead, if you do this with Ultimate SD Upscale, this works way better. Way better. Okay, so the settings you want to have here are, ideally you want to use this model here, this 4x face up dat. Of course, you could use any model. I like this upscale model. It tends to keep the detail of the image and doesn't smooth it out. Like if you use like the other upscale models like Really Organ or these sorts of other upscalers, they tend to smooth out the image a lot, which you don't want. So this one is much better for that. And even though this is a 4x upscaler, setting it to 2 is better. Like, well, 1, because you can actually have this finish in a reasonable amount of time. If you set it to 4, it's going to take forever. It's going to take very, very long. The amount of space it's going to take on your VRAM is not going to change because the actual size of the tile stays the same. It's just that when you have a smaller upscale, the amount of the original image the tile takes up is a smaller amount. I'll show a graphic here so you can understand what I mean. At 2.0, it works fine. So you don't need to set it to 4 even though the model was trained to upscale things by 4. And then we just use the EULA normal. We're not going to do anything fancy. The denoise is at 2.0. We have tile width at 512 by 512. Again, ideally this is what you use if you want this to finish in a reasonable amount of time. Flux can work at like lower resolutions as well, so you don't have to worry about this. And also, you're just doing denoising. It's not the same as like generating an image from scratch. Like, yeah, you don't have to change any of the other settings. This is fine as it is. And if you do that, then you end up with an image like this. You now end up where you have a lot more of the sharpness of some of the other images, but it still gives you that realism of the lower guidance setting. And overall, it adds a lot of the additional detail on the desk, her skin especially. You end up with a lot of these molds and little, but again, remember I told you, she's not going to be covered in mold because it's in general, it's kind of a weak thing. So she end up with a lot more detail in the molds. Obviously her clothing here, you end up with a lot of stuff here where it really starts to look more like realistic. I'd still say that you could improve this. Obviously in this video, we didn't use any LoRa's or any other additional techniques, largely because I feel like those are still developing right now. Like some LoRa's are kind of not very good and they're still trying to figure out how exactly that's going to work with Flux. So I felt it didn't make sense to put those in this video when it's not even developed that as yet that well. I'll show some other images that using this methodology that you can generate as well to give you a better sense of what it can accomplish as opposed to just this one image. But like, yeah, that's a good way to go about approaching Flux when it comes to generating realistic images. Like the ideal thing is that you break the image up into parts and then you start thinking of how to add more interesting elements to the image. Like I have a bunch of other examples I'll try to show like how to think about making the image more interesting as opposed to just a person standing somewhere doing nothing of interest. Yeah guys, thanks for watching the video. Catch you in the next video. Hopefully, if you don't have Flux installed, as I said, I have a video about how to install Flux. Hopefully you didn't just watch a video about generating images with Flux, but you don't even have Flux altogether. I mean, I guess technically you could use Flux on like Twitter, or you could use it on like some of the free like generators or whatever. But still. Anyway, guys, catch you in the next video, and yeah.